in the mountains of Appalachia, in the isolated ridges and hollows of southwestern Virginia, eastern Tennessee, and eastern Kentucky, there lived for generations a people who did not fit any of the racial categories that early American society had constructed to organize itself. They were not classified as white. They were not classified as black. They were not classified as Native American. They were something else, something that the legal and social machinery of colonial and early American society had no adequate category for, and that the people themselves described in ways that kept shifting across the generations. They called themselves, or were called, Melungeons. The word's origin is itself disputed. Some have proposed Portuguese derivations. Some have suggested French or Turkish roots. Others believe it was simply an invented slur, a label applied from outside to mark a people as different, without explaining what that difference was. For most of American history, the Melungeon question was treated as a local curiosity, the kind of folk mystery that mountain communities generate, and that outsiders found charming or disturbing depending on their own racial assumptions. What the Melungeons themselves said about their origins varied enormously. Some claimed to be Portuguese, descendants of early European explorers who had come to the New World before the English and settled in the mountains. Some said they were Turks, brought to America as slaves by the Spanish and then freed. Some claimed Cherokee or other Native American ancestry. Some traced themselves to the lost colony of Roanoke, the English settlement that disappeared in 1590 and whose fate has never been definitively established. The oral traditions were multiple, contradictory, and fiercely maintained. What they all had in common was the insistence that they were not black. In the racial hierarchy of the American South, being classified as black meant being subject to the full weight of slavery and its legal apparatus. Being classified as white, or as Native American, or as anything else was a form of protection, however incomplete. The Melungeons' multiple origin stories were not simply folk traditions. They were, in part, survival strategies in a society organized around a racial binary that threatened to destroy them. In 2012, a DNA study published in the Journal of Genetic Genealogy gave the first comprehensive genomic answer to the question of who the Melungeons actually were, and the answer was neither what the oral traditions had claimed, nor what the racial mythology of American history had assumed. The 2012 study, led by researcher Roberta Estes and a team of genetic genealogists, analyzed Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA from individuals who could document Melungeon ancestry through genealogical records. The sample included descendants of the core Melungeon families whose names appear consistently in the historical record, names like Collins, Gibson, Goins, Bunch, and Bowling, family names that Appalachian genealogists had identified across generations of Melungeon community records. The results were, in the precise sense of the word, unexpected. The Y chromosome data, which traces the direct male line, showed haplogroups that were overwhelmingly associated with sub-Saharan African and European populations, specifically a combination of haplogroups common in West Africa and in Western Europe. The mitochondrial data showed haplogroups associated with both European and Native American populations. What this meant, translated into plain language, was that the Melungeon male line was primarily the product of unions between African men and European women, or African men and women of mixed Native American and European ancestry, not Portuguese, not Turkish, not Native American in the male line. The founding Melungeon fathers were, in the genomic evidence, primarily men of sub-Saharan African descent, most likely free black men or formerly enslaved men, who had escaped or been freed in the colonial period, who had formed families in the isolated Appalachian Mountains, with women of European and Native American ancestry. This was not the story anyone had told, not the romantic Portuguese navigator origin, not the Roanoke lost colony theory, not the Cherokee heritage claim. The DNA pointed toward something more specific, more historically grounded, and in the context of American racial history, more charged than any of the folk traditions. To understand why this finding matters beyond genealogical curiosity, you need to understand the historical context in which the Melungeon communities formed. The late 17th and early 18th centuries in colonial Virginia and the Carolinas were a period of intense legal construction of racial categories. The colony of Virginia began passing laws in the 1680s and 1690s that explicitly tied legal status to racial classification. The category of whiteness was being legally defined and defended as a property, a social position, a legal standing that could be preserved or lost depending on who you were documented as being. Free black people in colonial Virginia occupied an extraordinarily precarious position. They were not enslaved, but they were subjected to increasing legal restrictions on their freedom, their ability to own property, their ability to testify in court, their ability to move and work. As the slave system hardened and the racial binary became more rigid, free black men and women faced the prospect of a future in which every generation would be more constrained than the last. Moving into the mountains was one response to this pressure. The Appalachian highlands were beyond the effective reach of the colonial legal machinery. Land was available that no one else particularly wanted. The communities that formed there were isolated enough to develop their own social rules, their own kinship networks, their own ways of managing the racial categories that the lowland world was imposing with increasing severity. What the DNA shows is that this is, at least in significant part, what happened. Men of African descent moved into the mountains, formed families with women who were European or of mixed Native American and European ancestry, and built communities that maintained a collective identity distinct from both the white and the black categories that the surrounding society was enforcing. The Melungeon origin stories, with their Portuguese navigators and Turkish sailors and Cherokee grandmothers, were the cultural armor of people who needed to be something other than what the law said they were. The DNA finding did not simplify the Melungeon story. It complicated it in ways that different members of the community found differently meaningful. Some descendants welcomed the African ancestry finding as a restoration of a history that had been deliberately obscured. For them, the DNA confirmed what careful genealogical work had been suggesting for years: that the Melungeon communities were founded in significant part by free African Americans who were escaping the racial violence of the colonial South, and that this was a story of extraordinary resilience and survival rather than a shameful secret. Others found the findings more difficult. The oral traditions of Portuguese or Turkish origin had been maintained for generations with real emotional investment. Families had built their sense of identity around specific origin stories, and the DNA's refusal to confirm those stories was, for some, a kind of loss. The science did not simply answer a question. It displaced a narrative that had been doing important cultural work for centuries. And the finding raised questions that the DNA study itself could not answer. If the founding Melungeon men were primarily of African descent, what exactly were their circumstances? Were they freed slaves who had bought or been given their freedom? Were they runaways who had escaped to the mountains? Were they free black men who had been free for multiple generations? The historical record of free black life in early colonial Virginia is fragmentary and poorly preserved, because a society organized around the legal erasure of certain people's humanity did not invest heavily in documenting those people's lives. The DNA tells us the ancestry. It cannot tell us the stories of the specific individuals whose choices built the Melungeon communities. The Melungeon story sits within a much larger pattern that the ancient and modern DNA revolution has made newly visible across the Americas. The racial categories that early American society constructed were legally rigorous, but biologically porous. People moved across the categories, through marriage, through migration, through the quiet subversions of a society that could not actually enforce the biological boundaries it was legally constructing. The Melungeons are one of the clearest documented cases of this porosity. African American men and European and Native American women, forming families in the mountains, producing a community that maintained enough distinctiveness to generate its own mythology, and enough ambiguity to escape the worst consequences of the racial binary for multiple generations. What is remarkable about the Melungeon case is how the community's survival strategy worked. By insisting on an exotic origin, Portuguese, Turkish, whatever, by refusing to accept the category of black that the surrounding society wanted to impose, the Melungeon communities maintained access to legal and social standing that would have been denied to people classified as black. It was not a comfortable or stable position. Melungeon communities faced discrimination, legal challenges to their status, and periods of intense social pressure. But it was a strategy that worked well enough for long enough that the communities survived and maintained their distinct identity into the 20th century. The DNA does not judge this strategy. It records the ancestry that lay beneath it, and that the strategy was designed to obscure. The African ancestry that the DNA reveals is not a scandal. It is the biological record of a group of people who made choices under extraordinary historical pressure and built something that survived. The question of what Melungeon identity means today, after the DNA study, is one that community members are working out for themselves. Some have embraced the African American heritage as a recovered truth. Some have focused on the Native American elements of the mitochondrial data, the mother's line, as the authentic core of their identity. Some have emphasized the mixed and indeterminate nature of the genetic profile as itself a meaningful identity, a refusal of the racial binary that tried to define them. What the DNA cannot do is tell any of these people who they are in the full sense. It can tell them where their ancestors came from. It cannot tell them what that means for how they should understand themselves. That is a human question, a cultural question, a question about the relationship between biological ancestry and lived identity that science can inform but not resolve. The Melungeons were never what the surrounding culture wanted them to be. They were not white enough to be protected by whiteness. They were not black in the way the law defined it, though the DNA now shows that they were more African in ancestry than their origin stories admitted. They were not purely Native American, though Native American women were among their founders. They were the specific and irreproducible result of a historical moment in which the racial categories of early American society met the human reality of people who would not be contained by them. The mountains held them. The stories sustained them. The DNA, 3 centuries later, finally told the truth about where the stories came from and what they were protecting. And what they were protecting, it turns out, was something more American than any of the racial categories that tried to define them. The evidence of a people who refused to disappear. There is one final thing the DNA record makes visible, that the historical record obscures almost entirely: the women. The mitochondrial DNA, which traces the maternal line, shows haplogroups associated with both European and Native American populations. The founding mothers of the Melungeon community were European women and women of Native American ancestry who chose, or were placed by circumstance, into unions with African men in the mountains of Appalachia. Their names are largely lost. The historical record preserved the family names of the men, the Collins and Gibson and Goins lines that genealogists have traced for generations. The women's stories, the specific circumstances under which they built lives in the mountain communities, are even less documented than the men's. But they were there. The DNA records their presence, and the communities they built with the men whose African ancestry the Y chromosome data reveals are the proof that the racial binary the colonial legal system was constructing had real human beings working against it from the beginning. The Melungeons were never simply a mystery. They were the visible edge of a much larger invisible history. Millions of Americans carry ancestry that crossed the racial lines that early American society enforced. The Melungeons are simply the community that maintained enough distinctiveness, enough of a named collective identity, to attract the genealogical and genetic attention that made their story recoverable. The mountains held them, the stories sustained them, and the DNA found them, 300 years later, exactly where they had always been. They were never what we thought. They were something harder and stranger and more human, the specific product of a specific historical moment, when some people chose freedom in the mountains over the category the valley wanted to give them. That choice built communities. Those communities built stories. And those stories, the Portuguese navigators, and the Turkish sailors, and the Cherokee grandmothers, were never lies. They were armor. And the DNA is not the dismantling of that armor. It is the recovery of the people who wore it.